A busy street in the heart of the city. The sounds of car horns and people talking fill the air. The camera zooms in on a street vendor, Henry, setting up his stall. On a normal day in the bustling streets of Willow Avenue, a peaceful vendor sets up his stall. But today, things are about to change in ways no one could have imagined. A simple act of injustice will spark a movement that no one saw coming. When a pair of racist cops target a defenseless vendor, the streets will explode in outrage. But little do they know, this isn't just about one man. This is the beginning of something much bigger. Stay tuned. What happens next will leave you speechless, and the truth will shock the world. Before we dive into this powerful story, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable stories like this one. It was a regular Monday morning when chaos erupted on the corner of 5th and Willow Streets. The busy urban streets hummed with the usual rush cars honking, the chatter of pedestrians filling the air, and the occasional rattle of street vendors calling out their wares. The sun cast its usual golden warmth, but something about the morning felt different. There was an electric tension in the air, almost like the city knew something was about to happen, something that would change everything. At the center of it all was a humble vendor, Henry Johnson. Henry, a man in his late 60s, had been selling his goods on the corner of Willow Street for decades. His stall was simple, just a table covered with fruit and vegetables he grew in his small garden. He knew every face that passed by, exchanging pleasantries with everyone from the young school kids to the businessmen rushing to their offices. Henry was a fixture in this community, someone who made the streets feel more human, but today he was about to be swept into a nightmare. The police had been patrolling the area more frequently in the last few months, and their presence was never a comforting sight. On this particular day, two officers, Detectives Mark Stevens and Ryan Calloway, pulled up in their squad car, a few paces down from Henry's stall. They were known around the neighborhood for their abrasive, often aggressive demeanor, especially when dealing with the local vendors. The rumors of their treatment of the people they interacted with were never good, and today, it seemed, they were looking for a reason to escalate. "All right, you," Officer Stevens barked, his voice cutting through the murmur of the busy street. "You're blocking the sidewalk again." Henry looked up, his lined face creasing with confusion. He had been setting up his stall as he had every morning for years. There was no obstruction. "I'm just setting up, officer," he said in his usual calm tone. Stevens took a few steps forward, his boots tapping against the pavement with purpose. "Doesn't matter. Pack up, or we'll handle this the hard way." Henry's brow furrowed, his weathered hands pausing as he looked up at the officers. "I've been here for years. You know me. What's the problem now?" Before Henry could even finish speaking, Calloway, the younger of the two, stepped forward, a sneer tugging at the corners of his lips. "No talking back," he spat, the words barely leaving his mouth before he grabbed Henry by the arm, pulling him roughly away from the table. The crowd around them began to stir, whispers of disbelief starting to rise. Some people turned their heads, others stopped in their tracks, watching in shock. But no one stepped forward. They had seen this before. The officers were a force to be reckoned with. Henry struggled to keep his balance, his old legs buckling under the sudden force. "Let go of me," he exclaimed, his voice rising with frustration and fear. Stevens, who had remained a few steps behind, looked on with a smirk, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You should have listened, old man," he muttered under his breath. "Now you're going to learn what happens when you don't comply." The surrounding crowd fell eerily silent, unsure whether to intervene or turn away, afraid of the consequences. Calloway tightened his grip on Henry, spinning him around as the vendor tried to break free. Henry, a man who had faced countless struggles in his life, had never felt the kind of powerlessness that was sinking in now. But what happened next was far worse than anything he could have imagined. Without warning, Stevens lunged forward. His hand shot out like a missile, grabbing Henry by the throat. His fingers dug into the skin, squeezing with a vicious force. "I said, no talking back," he growled, the words dripping with venom. The world around Henry went hazy as he gasped for air, his hands frantically clawing at the officer's iron grip. His vision blurred, his body weakening under the suffocating hold. Desperation flooded him as the crowd gasped and stepped back, some even covering their eyes, too afraid to act. Suddenly, there was a movement, a blur in the crowd. A loud crash echoed through the air. Without anyone really noticing, a figure emerged from the crowd, charging toward the scene like a force of nature. The figure was tall, his face stern with anger and resolve. His footsteps pounded the pavement as he reached the officers, shoving them aside with one forceful motion. "Get your hands off him," the man shouted, his voice thunderous. "What do you think you're doing?" The officers turned, startled by the sudden interference, but their surprise quickly turned to rage. "Stay out of this, or we'll arrest you too," Stevens threatened, stepping toward the newcomer. The man didn't flinch. "Not today," he said firmly, his hands balling into fists. "You're not taking another person down today." The crowd that had been frozen in fear began to stir. Some whispered, others pulled out their phones, recording the scene. The tension was thick, the air crackling with a mixture of fear and defiance. But before the situation could escalate further, a shrill voice broke through the tension. "Hey, stop right there." A figure emerged from the crowd, another officer, but this one wearing a more official uniform. He was tall, dark-skinned, and had a serious expression on his face. He raised his hand, signaling for the two officers to step back. "Stevens, Calloway, what do you think you're doing?" There was a beat of stunned silence before Stevens released his grip, looking back at the newcomer with disbelief. "What? We were just—" "You were choking him, Mark," the officer snapped. "This is not how we handle things. Stand down now." The crowd remained silent, their eyes glued to the scene. No one knew who this officer was, but his arrival had shifted the power dynamic in the most unexpected way. Stevens and Calloway were now the ones in the hot seat, and the crowd began to murmur again, their eyes darting between the officers and the new arrival. But this moment of tension was only the beginning. Unbeknownst to everyone watching, the truth about these officers and the deadly secrets they carried was about to be exposed in the most unimaginable way. The atmosphere remained thick with tension as the newly arrived officer who had swiftly intervened now stood between Henry and the two detectives. His presence was a stark contrast to the cold aggression that had just been unleashed. He was a seasoned officer, his uniform crisp and unruffled, his eyes sharp with an unwavering focus. The crowd, though still shaken, watched as the officer assessed the situation with cold calculation. "Mark, Ryan," the officer began, his voice a mixture of authority and disappointment. "You both know the rules. You don't use force unless it's necessary, and this—" he gestured to Henry, who was gasping for air, still holding his throat in disbelief. "This is not necessary. You do not choke a man for standing in his own space." Stevens and Calloway exchanged a glance, their faces flushed with frustration, but neither spoke. They had been caught red-handed, and the heat of the moment had worn off, leaving behind a simmering resentment. Calloway was the first to speak, his tone dripping with disdain. He was resisting arrest. The new officer turned to face him, his eyes narrowing. "Resisting arrest? You've got to be kidding me." He was minding his business, and you two made it personal. He shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't care what your history is. This ends now. Mark, Ryan, you two need to go back to the station and report this. I'll handle things from here." The words hit the officers like a slap in the face, but they didn't dare protest. They had seen this officer around before, Captain Michael Lewis, a man known for his strict adherence to protocol, and more importantly, his fair handling of situations. He wasn't the kind of man you messed with, especially not when cameras were rolling and the eyes of the neighborhood were watching. As the officers reluctantly stepped back, Henry finally found the strength to straighten himself. His hands still trembled as he wiped away the sweat beading on his forehead. The pain in his throat was sharp, but it didn't compare to the anger that boiled inside him. He had been a part of this community for so long, decades even, and yet he had never felt more like an outsider than in this moment. "I should have just kept my mouth shut," Henry muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse. He felt the weight of humiliation settle on his shoulders. The whole street had seen it, his dignity stripped away by two men who had no business being in charge. Captain Lewis turned to Henry, his voice softening. "You all right, sir?" he asked, his hand resting on Henry's shoulder, offering some semblance of comfort. Henry nodded but didn't say anything. The situation was still too fresh, too raw. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," Lewis said, his eyes filled with genuine remorse. "But you're not alone. There are others who won't let this slide." Henry glanced up at him, the first flicker of hope in his eyes. But before he could respond, a loud voice interrupted the moment. "What the hell is going on here?" A tall, imposing figure stepped through the crowd, his broad shoulders blocking the light. It was none other than Detective Stevens' superior, Captain Morgan, a man with a reputation for turning a blind eye to his officers' misdeeds, as long as they kept things quiet. Morgan's gaze shifted from Henry to Captain Lewis, his lips curling into a sneer. "What is this? You going soft on me now, Michael? You know how things work around here?" He crossed his arms over his chest, clearly unimpressed by the growing crowd and the cameras that had started recording the scene. Lewis didn't flinch, his posture unwavering. "This is about justice, Morgan, not protecting corrupt officers." Morgan's eyes flickered with anger. You think you're the only one who cares about justice. These streets need us to maintain order, and you're playing hero in front of a bunch of civilians. This is what happens when you get soft. The tension between the two men was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats and power plays. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to murmur again. Some recorded the scene with their phones. Others whispered in hushed tones about the growing rift between the two officers. Henry's heart raced. He didn't know what was worse, the physical assault he had just endured, or the sense of helplessness that seemed to follow him everywhere he went. But as Captain Lewis stood firm, refusing to back down, something changed within Henry. He wasn't going to let this slide. Not now, not after everything he had been through. Listen to me, Henry suddenly said, his voice shaking with a newfound resolve. You can't keep treating us like this. I've lived here for over 30 years, and I've seen it all. The intimidation, the abuse, but not anymore. Not while I'm still standing. The words were heavy, and for a moment the crowd fell silent. Even Captain Morgan seemed momentarily taken aback by Henry's declaration. It was rare for someone like him, a street vendor, an elderly man, to stand up to the authorities like this. But that was when the unexpected happened. He's right, you know, a voice called out from the crowd. It was a young man, his face determined, stepping forward from the throng of onlookers. He was no more than 25, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, but there was something fierce in his eyes. This kind of thing has been going on for too long. His words were like a spark in a powder keg. One by one, more people stepped forward. The young man was quickly joined by an older woman, then a couple of teenagers, and soon a small group was standing in solidarity with Henry. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were participants in something much bigger. Captain Morgan's face twisted with irritation as he looked around, realizing that his control over the situation was slipping. Get them out of here, he barked at his officers. But before anyone could react, the man from the crowd, his voice louder now, called out to the rest of the gathering. Don't let them scare you. This city belongs to all of us, and we won't let you bully us anymore. It was a rallying cry, one that rippled through the crowd like a wave. The energy shifted from fear to something far stronger, defiance. People began to chant, their voices rising in unison. No more silence, no more fear. The officers were stunned. They had expected a quick resolution, a simple show of authority. But what they didn't account for was the power of a community united. The truth about their actions, their history of corruption, abuse, and racial profiling, was about to come crashing down on them. And as the chant grew louder, Henry felt a sense of empowerment he hadn't felt in years. Today wasn't just about him anymore, it was about all of them. The truth was coming out, and there was no turning back. The chants from the crowd grew louder, reverberating off the walls of nearby buildings. No more silence, no more fear. It wasn't just a protest, it was a declaration, one that sent a shockwave through the street. People who had once kept their heads down in fear now stood tall, united in a cause they hadn't dared speak of before. They weren't just witnesses to the abuse anymore, they were taking a stand. Captain Morgan's face flushed a deep shade of red as the voices of the crowd filled the air. His fists clenched at his sides, and his jaw tightened in a way that suggested he was about to snap. But before he could bark out another order, Captain Lewis stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. Enough, Morgan, Lewis said, his tone calm but firm. This ends now. Morgan's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? These people are just a bunch of troublemakers. We can't let them take over our streets. I said enough, Lewis repeated, his eyes locking with Morgan's. You've gone too far this time. Henry, still standing at the center of it all, watched the exchange with a mixture of disbelief and anticipation. It was one thing to witness officers abusing their power, but it was another thing entirely to see one of their own stand up against it. For a moment, it felt as though the world was shifting beneath his feet, and the impossible was becoming possible. We're not going to let this go, the young man from the crowd shouted again, his voice cutting through the tension. His words seemed to fuel the crowd even further. They were no longer afraid. Not of the officers, not of anything. Morgan's face contorted with rage as he stepped toward Lewis. You can't be serious, Michael. These are just a few people making noise. You're going to let them walk all over you. He was almost spitting with anger, his voice rising as he continued to press forward. But Lewis didn't budge. This isn't about you or your pride, Morgan. This is about doing what's right. The crowd grew restless as the standoff between the two officers dragged on. Whispers spread like wildfire, each person wondering what was going to happen next. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Henry could sense the change in the air. The tide had turned, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. He stepped forward, his voice stronger than before. You've had your time, Henry called out, addressing both the officers and the crowd. "You've had your control, but not anymore. We're done letting you walk all over us." There was a sharp intake of breath from the crowd, and then in unison they began to clap. The sound was slow at first, but soon it grew louder, filling the air with a sense of solidarity. It was a moment of victory, even if it was still far from over. Henry stood taller, his chest swelling with pride. The old man, who had been a fixture on this street for decades now, felt like a man with a purpose, like someone who could make a difference. Morgan, realizing that he had lost the crowd and the battle, seethed with frustration. He shot one final glare at Lewis, his eyes filled with venom. "You'll regret this, Michael, you all will." Without another word, Morgan turned on his heel, storming off with Calloway following close behind. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the two officers retreated, their heads low, their authority shattered. Lewis exhaled, his posture relaxing slightly as the tension finally began to break. He turned to face Henry, his expression softening. "Are you all right, sir?" Henry nodded, but his face was a mixture of emotions. He was still processing everything, what had just happened, the power that had shifted, and the truth that was beginning to surface. "I don't know what's going to happen next," Henry said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I know one thing. We can't let this go." Lewis nodded in agreement. "No, we won't." Before they could talk further, the sound of sirens cut through the air, a different kind of siren, the kind that was meant to bring reinforcements. The crowd instinctively tensed up again, unsure of what was coming next. Was this the calm before the storm, or was it a sign of real change? Suddenly, a police van screeched to a halt at the intersection, its tires screeching against the asphalt. More officers spilled out of the vehicle, uniformed officers, but they weren't from around here. They were part of the city's elite force, called in when things got out of control. They were known for being swift, merciless, and highly trained to handle situations like this. The crowd took a collective step back, their defiance wavering slightly as the new officers approached. But it wasn't fear that gripped them this time, it was uncertainty. What would happen next? Would they stand their ground, or would they be crushed under the weight of the system once again? Captain Lewis raised his hand to stop them, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Hold up, this situation is under control," he said, his voice steady but authoritative. "There's no need for further escalation." The new officers, led by a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Captain, we've been ordered to restore order. What's going on here?" Lewis gave him a cold look. "What's going on here is that the people are tired of being pushed around, and we're not going to let you take them down again." The tall officer stared at him for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if weighing his options. He glanced back at his men, who were already forming a tight circle around the area. They were here to restore order, but it was clear that the captain wasn't going to back down, not this time. But then, a surprising voice broke through the tension. "We're not going anywhere," the young man from earlier called out again, stepping forward. His words had the same fire they had before, but now, there was something else in them, something more resolute. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to stir again. They weren't backing down, they weren't afraid. Captain Lewis glanced at the tall officer, his expression hardening. "Get back in your van, this isn't your fight." The tall officer hesitated, his hand hovering over his radio. The moment hung in the air, suspended between authority and resistance. And for a brief second, it felt like everything was about to change. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. The crowd stood at the edge of the sidewalk, a mass of bodies, all eyes trained on the standoff unfolding before them. The new officers, still uncertain of what to do, seemed caught in a moment of indecision. The young man, who had been vocal from the start, stood firmly, his chest puffed with determination. Behind him, the rest of the crowd gathered in solidarity, their eyes full of defiance. Captain Lewis stood his ground, his eyes locked on the tall officer who had not yet made a move. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The street felt like a battleground, the weight of the situation hanging heavily in the air. "Not your fight?" the tall officer muttered under his breath. His eyes flicked between the crowd and Captain Lewis, unsure of whether to challenge his authority or back down. But the hesitation didn't last long. "Sir," he said, addressing Captain Lewis with a clipped tone, "we've been ordered to act. This can't go on any longer." Lewis's gaze hardened, but there was no fear in his eyes. "You're not listening," he said quietly, his voice sharp. "This isn't about orders anymore. This is about what's right." The crowd, sensing the gravity of the moment, stood even taller. They were no longer just spectators. They were participants in something much bigger. The young man who had spoken out earlier now raised his hand, signaling to those around him. A few nodded, and the ripple effect began. One by one, others stepped forward. They weren't backing down. Not now, not after everything that had happened. The tall officer shifted his weight, visibly uncomfortable under the pressure. His eyes scanned the sea of faces before him, seeing something he hadn't expected. These weren't just people standing up against the system. They were people who had been pushed to their limits, who had nothing left to lose, and that was what made them dangerous. He took a step back, glancing at the other officers who had started to look to him for direction. Captain Lewis, sensing the shift, spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "If you want to restore order, you need to start by listening to the people," he said firmly, his eyes narrowing. "These people aren't your enemies. They're your neighbors, your community." The tall officer clenched his jaw, his lips pressing together tightly. He could feel the tension building, the crowd's energy growing as the words settled in. They were right. They had a point. And for the first time, he questioned his own role in all of this. The silence that followed felt heavy. Every movement, every glance seemed amplified. Captain Lewis had the crowd's support, but the officers in front of him, especially the tall officer, still had a choice, and in that choice lay the key to everything. Just as the tension reached its peak, a new voice rang out, this time from a figure standing on the balcony of a nearby apartment building. It was a woman, mid-30s, dressed in a business suit. Her face was framed by a sleek ponytail, her posture confident as she spoke. "Enough," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. She stepped forward, addressing the officers and the crowd with equal intensity. "I know what's going on here, and I'm not going to stand by while it gets worse." The crowd turned to her, murmuring in curiosity. The tall officer, still unsure of what to do, glanced at her with a questioning look. "I'm Sophia Grant," the woman continued, "and I've been documenting police misconduct for the past 5 years. I've seen what happens when the system turns a blind eye, and I'm not going to let that happen here." The crowd went quiet. There was something powerful in her words, something that commanded attention. Sophia wasn't just another observer. She was a witness, an advocate for justice, and her presence changed the dynamic of the situation in an instant. "Do you want this to be just another day where nothing changes?" she asked, addressing the officers now. "Or do you want to be part of a movement that actually makes a difference?" The tall officer looked at her, then at Captain Lewis, and then back at the crowd. He was still unsure, but the uncertainty in his eyes had shifted. He wasn't looking at them as enemies anymore. He was starting to see them as people, as individuals who had been wronged. Sophia's gaze turned to Henry, standing in the center of it all. "Henry," she said softly, her voice filled with respect, "this isn't just your fight anymore. This is everyone's fight." Henry looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He had been just a street vendor, a small part of this vast city, but now, his story had become the catalyst for something much bigger. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you all for standing with me." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the streets. It was no longer just about Henry. It was about the community, the people who had been wronged for far too long. They had found their voice, and now they were demanding to be heard. Sophia's eyes scanned the crowd, her expression unwavering. She had seen what happened when people were pushed to the edge, when they were given no choice but to fight for their rights. And now, as she looked at the officers before her, she knew the truth was about to be laid bare. "Let's make sure this doesn't go unnoticed," she said, her voice steady. "Let's make sure the world knows what happened here today." As the sound of applause filled the air once again, the tall officer finally took a step back, a look of reluctant understanding on his face. He wasn't sure how things would play out, but one thing was clear: this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Not this time. And as the crowd began to disperse, their hearts filled with a sense of purpose, they knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. The fight for justice had just begun, and they were ready to see it through to the end. As the crowd began to disperse, their voices still buzzing with the energy of the moment, the air hung heavy with anticipation. The confrontation was over, but the real battle was just beginning. The officers had left, their pride wounded, their authority challenged in a way they hadn't anticipated. But the truth was now out, and there was no going back. The scene had calmed, but the weight of the words still lingered in the air. Henry stood at the edge of the sidewalk, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped away the sweat from his brow. The events of the past few hours felt like a blur, an overwhelming rush of emotions and actions that had propelled him from a simple vendor into the heart of a movement. It wasn't just his story anymore. It was everyone's story. Sophia Grant, The woman who had stepped in to challenge the officers stood beside him. She had been a quiet observer for years, documenting the wrongs in her city. But today she had become a voice for the voiceless. She had shifted the momentum, changing the course of everything. Her presence had been the spark that ignited the crowd's fury, but it was Henry's courage that had been the foundation. "Thank you, Sophia," Henry said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you for what you did today." Sophia smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that came from pride or accomplishment. It was a smile of understanding, of solidarity. "You don't need to repay me, Henry," she replied, her tone soft but resolute. "You've already done more than enough by standing up." Henry looked at the street around him. It was the same street that had been his home for years, but today it felt different. The air was thick with possibility. The crowd had stood up to the system, not just for him but for themselves. They had reclaimed their power, and in doing so, they had set something in motion, a wave of change that could not be stopped. But as the crowd faded and the officers left, there was still work to be done. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a larger fight, one that would take more than just one day, one protest or one speech to win. It would take time, effort, and unwavering determination. Sophia turned to Henry, her gaze thoughtful. "This is only the beginning. They'll try to cover it up, to discredit the whole thing, but we can't let them. The world needs to know the truth." Henry nodded, his mind racing. He had never been involved in something like this before, but he could feel the fire burning inside him. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. He wasn't going to let the system win. The following weeks were a blur of activity. The footage from the street that day went viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. The image of Henry, a man who had been mistreated by the very people meant to protect him, standing tall in the face of injustice, became a symbol of resistance. The truth about the officers, their history of corruption, racial profiling, and abuse began to surface, one revelation at a time. But the backlash came quickly. News outlets, some sympathetic to the cause, others determined to downplay it, fought for control of the narrative. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave, and an internal investigation was launched. But everyone knew the truth. This wasn't just a simple case of misconduct. It was a reflection of a broken system, one that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Sophia continued to lead the charge, rallying people to join the movement. Protests sprung up in other parts of the city, and soon the story reached the national stage. The demand for accountability grew louder. People who had once been afraid to speak out now found their voices, inspired by Henry's courage and the strength of the community. But even as the movement gained momentum, the powers that be fought back. They attempted to discredit the witnesses, to twist the truth, and to paint Henry and his supporters as troublemakers. But it was too late. The floodgates had opened, the truth had been exposed, and there was no turning back. Then, one day, the announcement came. The two officers, Mark Stevens and Ryan Calloway, were fired from the force. The investigation revealed a history of abuse, and it wasn't just Henry's case that had been swept under the rug. It was a pattern that stretched back years. But the victory was bittersweet. The system that had allowed this to happen was still in place. There was still work to be done. Henry stood at the front of a rally a few months later, surrounded by the people who had supported him from the beginning. The streets were filled with chants of justice, and the air was electric with the energy of change. "We did this together," Henry's voice echoed through the microphone, his words strong and unwavering. "But it's not over. This fight is just beginning." The crowd roared in agreement. The journey had been long, but they had won a battle. And as long as the fight for justice continued, they would keep pushing forward. Sophia stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, proud of how far they had come. This wasn't just Henry's fight anymore. It was the fight of a generation. And the truth, no matter how hard they tried to bury it, had finally come to light.